Alright, so everyone knows about like drive gauge penalty, right? Normally, you regenerate drive gauge over time without doing anything. You regenerate drive gauge faster by walking forwards, slower by walking backwards, much slower by being airborne, etc. But anytime you spend an action that costs drive gauge, you're put into a delay before your drive gauge starts to regenerate. Now this goes through any other action that you would take. For instance, if you do a drive rush into nothing, you're put into a heavy meter drive gauge penalty where there's a long delay. It's the same with whiffing parry. You're put into a long delay before you can continue. They're pretty much the same thing. So if you whiff parry and then you land like heavy punch on block, whatever, you still generate the same amount that you would normally generate for heavy punch. You still generate the same amount that you would extra for walking forwards, but without the normal amount of drive gauge regen that you would normally have until that point where it finally recovers. That being said, you're not put into a penalty for being airborne or walking backwards during this state like you would normally be if relative to your normal drive gauge regen if you were not in a meter penalty. So, in reality, when you are in a drive gauge penalty like this, some actions become slightly more cost-effective than they would normally be. So, again, jumping like normal kills your drive gauge regen over time, but if you're already in a drive gauge penalty, it's no different. So, it becomes slightly, ever so slightly less detrimental to you to be airborne while in drive gauge penalty than if you're just normal and you're regenerating drive gauge. Again, so all the actions that would normally build you drive gauge, like doing specific attacks and stuff on block or on hit, they will still do that, but if you weren't in a drive gauge penalty, you would build more, because you would build the drive gauge from those actions in addition to the regen over time. So in reality, when you get put into drive gauge penalty by doing one of these actions, the cost that you take from it is actually completely unavoidable, basically, except in certain circumstances where you could no longer regen drive gauge anyways. So for instance, if you land a combo, and if you do like something like this, right? So if you do like just a quick like a low forward, whatever, blah, and you quickly end the combo, right? You're still in a lingering drive gauge penalty from when you did the drive rush cancel. That being said, if you do a longer combo, as everyone knows, as soon as you spend a drive rush within the middle of a combo, a raw drive rush or a drive rush cancel like this, you're not allowed to regen drive gauge for the rest of the combo. So you would be basically in meter penalty anyways. It's not the same as meter penalty, because meter penalty doesn't stop you from regenerating drive gauge on strikes like it does when you spend it in a combo like this. But the point is that when you come out of a combo, your drive gauge penalty is completely done because the combo took long enough. It wasted enough time that you overcame your drive gauge penalty before it even actually mattered and before you were even physically allowed to start regenerating drive gauge anyways. So therefore, in this instance, doing a drive rush cancel like this costs exactly 3 bars and no more. Whereas if you did it on block and you like go for you do something into fucking like you know, that. Wait, what? Oh, wake up. No. Into a mix, you're still in a drive gauge penalty when you come out of this. So one thing that you can do is, okay, for instance, but each individual action has a different drive gauge penalty. So for instance, let me time it. So if we start regenerating drive gauge, right? And we start it at this point, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's about 6 seconds to regenerate a full bar of drive gauge under normal circumstances, assuming you're standing still. Okay, that's like the normal rate of regeneration that is always present, unless you're airborne or walking backwards, which are the only things that affect that natural regenerative state. Alright, then we have, let's say you block something. Alright, so Blanca blocks, so 0, 0, 1, 2, 3. So about 2 seconds, about a little bit more than 2 seconds is the delay before he starts regenerating. So if we measure that in terms of how much drive gauge he would have regenerated, again, 6 seconds is a full bar of drive gauge. So a little bit over 2 seconds is a bit under half a bar of drive gauge. So probably about 0.3, 0.4 bars of drive gauge, etc. that he is losing. So he loses like 0.4 from blocking the heavy punch itself, and then he loses an additional 0.3 or 0.35 from the drive gauge penalty that he's placed into. Now here's the thing. If you whiff a parry, that is the longest drive gauge... If you whiff a parry or do a raw drive rush, that is the longest meter penalty you can be put into. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It is an entire bar's worth of drive gauge. So in reality, whenever you do a raw drive rush, it doesn't actually cost 1 bar. It actually costs 2 bars. Okay? Practically speaking, doing a raw drive rush costs you 2 bars of drive gauge in terms of what you would have had you not done that. So, the other thing about this is that, let's say two things happen at once, right? Like 2 different actions that cause a drive gauge penalty happen at once. So let's say you do a raw drive rush or whiff a parry and then you block something, right? So if Blanca does whiff parry and then he blocks, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5. Even though normally just blocking something, which is the second thing that occurred, he whiffed a parry and then he blocked something. Blocking something applies like about 0.2, or about 2 seconds of drive gauge penalty. But instead, after he blocked something, he was still in a drive gauge penalty for about 5 seconds afterwards. Now the reason for that is because his drive gauge penalty from doing the whiff parry was more, okay? So if I were to illustrate this, right? So let's say you do 2 things. So over like a however many second period, you do first action, okay? You do whiff parry, so parry, and you do this, and then 1 second later, you do, you block something. So the whiff parry lasts for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 seconds, and the block at this point lasts for 1, 2, 2.5, about there, okay? So because the block starts 1 second in after the parry, but then its drive gauge penalty that would have put you under ends early before the drive gauge penalty of the parry, it's basically like the drive gauge penalty if the block doesn't exist. It doesn't add the 2 together, it doesn't make it 6 seconds plus the 2.5 from the block. It just takes whichever one will last longer from the current point. Which means that you can do things like, for example, if you do a raw drive rush, okay? If you do a raw drive rush, you basically spent 2 bars, because you spend 1, and then it's a full 6 seconds before you start regenerating, so you spent another 1 in terms of your penalty, okay? Now, if you do a drive rush cancel, like this, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, about 3.5 to 4 seconds. So, if we do something like this, for instance, so normally, raw DR is equal to 2 bars of drive gauge cost. DRC, drive rush cancel, is equal to 3 plus 3.5 seconds, so about 3.5 cost of drive gauge, okay? So if we were to do a raw drive rush and a drive rush cancel, theoretically it should cost us 5.5 bars of effective drive gauge. However, what if we structure our offense like this? We do a raw drive rush. Okay, so for Cammy it would look like this. If we do a raw drive rush, into like crouch fierce, and it's +5. Then we can frame trap with stand fierce. So raw drive rush, crouch fierce, then do it again. So into like that. How much drive gauge penalty will it be after we do, like, let's say, light knuckle to end it? So, oops. Nope. 0, 0, 1, 2, 0, 1, 2. Okay, about 1.5 to 2 seconds drive gauge penalty. So, what, again, should have effectively cost 5.5. We should have, like, based on the two actions that we did, raw drive rush and drive rush cancel, we should be, like, have lost 4 bars of drive gauge and be in a drive gauge penalty for another additional 1.5 bars of drive gauge if it were just an additive system, but it's not. So instead, you can start something that has an incredibly long drive gauge penalty, but so long as you cover it with an additional action like a DRC. So if you did, like, let's say here, a DRC, okay, that lasts for 3.5 seconds, you can optimize it so that you basically cut out the cost of the DRC in terms of drive gauge penalty, because both penalties will end at the exact same time. So neither one extended the original drive gauge penalty. So you can optimize raw drive rush by adding in another drive rush cancel afterwards, and you can effectively cut out the main penalty of the raw drive rush that you would normally suffer from by optimizing it in order to have this. The fact that it's not an additive system and that it just takes whichever one is currently longer, you can use it to basically cut out a drive gauge penalty you would have otherwise suffered. So instead of suffering both of these things, you only suffer one of them, and you get the full value of both of them. So this is an instance where we can... I hope I explained this in a way that makes sense. Basically, we can cheat the system and have less of a drive gauge penalty than we should for certain actions by doing a drive gauge action, putting ourselves in a meter penalty, and then putting ourselves into an additional meter penalty during that meter penalty in such a way that the overlapping meter penalties, like, are not additive, so we only take one, where if we had done these actions separately, we would have taken both of them. So we can do things that are much more cost-effective than if we did a raw drive rush by itself and if we did a DRC by itself, by stringing them together in sequences like this. Here, let me measure how much you actually save. Okay, so raw drive rush, or let's say, yeah, raw drive rush. So stand fierce builds you 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So stand fierce builds you 0.2 bars of drive gauge. Crouch fierce builds you 2, 1, 2, 3. Looks like a fourth. So each crouch fierce built me 0.25. Each stand fierce built me 0.2. And then the light knuckle built me, that looks also 0.2. So if we add them up, we just get a little calculator going. So 0.2 plus 0.2 plus 0.25 plus 0.25 plus 0.2 for the 2 crouch fierces, the 2 stand fierces, and the light knuckle. So that comes out to 1.1. So what we actually did here is that, and that comes out to 0, 1, 2. So about, like, we lose like 2.9 bars of drive gauge, plus we're in a meter penalty that's about like 0.2, 0.3. So let's say this costs like 3.2 bars of drive gauge effectively, when, as we already showed in the math, it should effectively cost 5.5. So we do, let's say this, plus the 3.2, so that comes out to 4.3, minus 5.5 is 1.2. That is how much drive gauge that we are saving by doing these actions in close proximity to each other. We are saving 1.2 bars of drive gauge by killing the meter penalty between both of these actions. So, yeah, this is pretty good stuff.